Good afternoon, everybody. This is Zoe Bywater from Belvoir, Bedford, and this is my colleague Jen. So give us a wave, Jen. This is probably a little bit of an extended Tenant Tuesday Tips session today. We wanted to have a little chat with everybody on the back of a really interesting article that we found on Landlord Today, where a company called Runrug, that is easy for some of you to say and not so easy for others, claims that 4 out of 10 tenancy deposits are not dealt with correctly, apparently. So what we wanted to do today is give tenants some ideas and tips in terms of how to ensure that they can get the most of their deposit back. So I've got some questions here to ask Jen, who's our portfolio and block manager at Belvoir, to see whether she can give you some help in terms of making sure you get all your money back or as much as possible. So first of all, Jen, could you tell me what is the key bit of information or the key document that tenants really should be referring to when moving out of a property?
So the key bit of information or documentation that you should refer to is your inventory. So you should be supplied with a copy of this when you move in. You'll usually be given a period of time to read through it and add any comments or pictures depending on how it's supplied. But when you move out, this is what you should be using as a guide or kind of a benchmark for what you need to be doing.
One of the things, obviously, that I mean, if you've lived in a property for, like, say, 5 years, would that inventory still be the best way of determining what condition that property should be in?
I mean, obviously, there's always got to take a view as to how long you've been in the property, because if you've been there, for example, 6 months, there's always going to be an element of wear and tear. So usually if your agent or landlord's done some periodic visits, if they've done reports on that, you can potentially use those because they would have monitored the condition of the property as well during the tenancy.
So let's say the agent and landlord, and obviously with the COVID situation that we've been in, hasn't actually visited the property. As a tenant, what do you think would be an important thing to get arranged prior to moving out?
So what you can look to do is speak to a landlord or letting agent and get them to arrange a kind of checkout inspection. That way what they can do is they can have a chat with you, have a look around the property and advise you what might need doing prior to you vacating. That'll mean that they can advise on things that you can, if there's any painting, for example, any maintenance that might need doing, and yeah, that's something that you can sort out.
I mean, I think, yeah, we'll get into the nitty-gritties, but one of the things that I think is really vitally important is just communicating with your landlord or your agent and understanding what their expectations are. Yeah. Now, one of the things that we do when a tenant gives notice is we give guidelines for vacating, which I think is probably some of the things we're going to touch on today is probably covered in that document. But if you're not with us as a tenant, it might be worth just speaking to your landlord about that. So, right, if we go through this lovely top 10 list that is not us, it's not by us, it's by the company called Runrug. Again, not very easy to say, Runrug. So one of the first things they mention, and obviously we'd be open if anyone is watching today, if you disagree or agree with this or have any comment to make, do just fire away, join in, and because that's the point of this, is that we can help you. The first thing it says is about painting, and it actually says to carry out a quick paint job. What are your thoughts on that, Jen?
I think sometimes a quick paint job might suffice if you've not really hung any pictures, or there's not been much furniture, or depending on the room, sometimes it will suffice, but other times that's not going to quite cut it. And also, you've got to have a look at, in terms of colours, that kind of thing. Probably worth speaking to your landlord or letting agent about what actually their expectations are. Again, it's all about speaking to them about what their expectations are, because your standard B&Q Magnolia might not be the right shade.
Other DIY shops are available.
Yeah. Yes. Not sponsored. Not sponsored.
But yeah, I think what we've learned over the years is that Magnolia can be many different colours, and sometimes a little sort of splash with a paintbrush over a mark where you've hung a picture might not be the best course of action. And I think it's to have that conversation with your landlord or agent in advance to just try and ensure that they're in agreement or not, and to obviously get everything in writing. Because then obviously you've got that audit trail. So the next thing they ask or mention is replacing light bulbs. What's the thoughts on that one?
So I think a lot of tenants get a bit confused even during the tenancy in terms of light bulbs. Obviously most light bulbs are pretty bog standard, quite easy to replace, but during the tenancy, sometimes you get the old tenant call in saying, can you get my light bulb replaced? But yes, it is your responsibility to replace those light bulbs when you vacate and keep them kind of maintained during the time you're there as well.
If you were to move into a property, however, and there were no light bulbs and none were working,
no,
would you still be responsible for replacing them?
No.
I just wanted to clarify that one. If you go into a property,
if you've got no light.
Yeah. The next one is about keys. It says replace any missing keys.
So what we do here at Belvoir, we actually have a photographic kind of record of any keys that we give our tenants. It's really important that you have this, or there's obviously some sort of record of what keys have been handed over to you at the start of your tenancy. That'll avoid any confusion when you vacate. It's also really important if you do get any cut during the time you're there. Obviously, we might like to have a family member or a friend, or if you go on a holiday, you might let them look after your cat or whatever. Really important to maybe it is important to let the landlord or letting agent know that's been done. Then we know kind of how many keys to expect when you kind of vacate the property.
A good agent or landlord will probably keep a good record of the comings and goings with keys. The next one's quite interesting. It says replace any broken items. So, I mean, what sort of things would you think that would refer to then?
So some tenancies, it's not too common, but some properties come fully furnished. So fully furnished can sometimes mean there's just some furniture in there, beds, etc. But some properties come with plates, bowls, cutlery, everything. So if any of those are damaged or lost during the tenancy, you would obviously be expected to replace those. Again, that should be fully listed on your inventory when you move into the property as to how many were present when you moved in, etc. I think it's also worth noting, I did make a quick note, obviously light bulbs, anything like soft furnishings, sometimes things like lampshades you may change during the tenancy, but the landlords ask you to store them, and then so you need to make sure those are all replaced before you go.
Okay, going off at a little bit of a tangent because you mentioned soft furnishings. What would you say to tenants about cutting off the unsightly no smoking labels on soft furnishings?
Please don't do that. If you do remove them and they're not there when you vacate, the item will need to be removed if it doesn't have a fire label.
Okay. All right. Next one it has here is leave your flat, or house, I assume, in a domestically clean condition. So what does that mean, domestically clean? Because obviously cleaning can mean many different things to many different people.
And this is one of the most common issues when it comes to deposit disputes is cleaning. So again, using your inventory as a benchmark, understanding your landlord or letting agent's expectation when it comes to cleaning. Obviously, if it states on your inventory that it was professionally cleaned by a company prior to you moving in, you're probably going to want to pay for a full end of tenancy clean. If it just marks it as clean, again, managing those expectations with your landlord or letting agent prior to you moving out will be good. But I would obviously give it a spruce up. It's always nice for whoever's coming in not to have to do any cleaning.
I think it's, cleaning is, everyone's definition of clean is different. And I think it's just understanding, again, the expectations. So there's no confusion at the end of the tenancy. I mean, the next one sort of leads on to that. Take out the rubbish. We all have been to properties after the end of a tenancy where bins are absolutely overflowing and bin day has been and gone. And what can you say on that one? Is there anything you want to add to that about bins and rubbish?
Yeah, so obviously sometimes when you do vacate a property, missing bin day as such might be unavoidable. Obviously what you can do, depending on the location of your property, is maybe just make sure you take it out before you do leave. If that isn't possible, obviously you can potentially look at taking what you can to the tip. Obviously, just bearing in mind at the moment, depending on kind of your local authority, you may need to book an appointment for that. But that's something you can look at doing. Again, it's never nice when you either move into a property or you're going to go in and do the final checkout and the bin's piled high with all sorts of bits and pieces.
Okay. The next one is about it says clean your freezer or fridge, should I say, and defrost the freezer.
Yeah.
I think I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but I've seen some really smelly. I've smelt some really smelly fridges and freezers. over the years. So what advice would you give tenants there?
There's been a few very smelly fridges in my time, I can tell you that. Yes, please do make sure that you defrost it. If you are defrosting it, make sure it's done while you're still there, so you can clean up any water or any kind of ice that's left. There's been a few occasions where I've been and it's either covered in water or the drawers are kind of covered in water. So yeah, give it a clean. Obviously, if it's something like an integrated fridge freezer, make sure you leave it on once you've cleaned it. And if you do turn it off, open it, because otherwise it will be very smelly.
Yeah. I think one of the tips I've learned is if you're okay to leave one behind, a pot towel, just fold it up and then just stick it inside of the door, ajar, and then that will keep that smell away. The other one is, if you've got a dishwasher, is run a lemon through it. That makes it smell nice and gives it a good clean. But obviously, make sure you take the lemon out.
Yeah.
The interesting thing about freezers, the amount of times I've gone into property and found like oven chips and peas in the bottom.
I know. That's it. It's always peas. It's
peas,
always
peas and oven chips.
Sweet corn. The odd fish finger.
So the next one is about making the place smell nice. I'm not quite sure about this one myself, because you know, if it's a few weeks before a new tenant's moving in,
it's going to be gone by the time.
I'm not quite sure that one. I get it. You might want to give it a little bit of spritz around and spray, but I'm not quite sure. Sometimes you could think that might hide a multitude of sins if you put a little air freshener in there. People might then be wondering, well, what you're trying to hide. So, I mean, one of the things that isn't mentioned on this list, I'm surprised at, is gardens. I mean, so I don't know what your thoughts are on gardens and how they should be at the end of a tenancy.
Yeah, I think gardening's always a difficult one, because you know, speaking from experience, there's some tenants who, you know, said, well, we're not gardeners. Obviously, there's an element of maintaining, you know, cutting the grass, making sure it's not overgrown with weeds. But again, inventory is your benchmark, and again, managing those expectations. Obviously, if it's a fully manicured, you know, landscape garden, there's obviously going to be some element of, you know, maintenance required. But the gardens is a difficult one, because some people are gardeners and some aren't.
Yeah, I think the thing is, I mean, if you look at your tenancy agreement, see what your responsibilities are there. And again, I think it's having that conversation with your landlord or your agent as to what their expectations are, because obviously it's seasonal. It could change. I mean, if it's the dead of winter, there's probably pretty much not a lot you can do with the garden, but it's just understanding what the agent and the landlord want from you at the end of your tenancy, and making sure. I think the key one for me is bushes, overgrown bushes, and just keeping them trimmed down, boys and girls. Sorry, it's been a long week and it's only Tuesday, but obviously, you know, the key there is check how high it is on your inventory and try and get it down to that level. And if it's I'd say a large tree or bush that you feel that is just way above your capabilities, speak to your landlord, because it may be that you have to get someone in professionally to do it. Sorry, I went off a little bit of a tangent there, didn't I? What about if you're living in a sort of joint property? So if you're in a house of multiple occupancy, what are your responsibilities there in terms of communal areas? Would that be something that individual you'd be responsible for, or would it be more everybody in there is responsible?
Yeah, so with communal areas, again, it should be stipulated in your tenancy agreement. If it's something like an HMO, you're more than likely going to be responsible jointly with your housemates. If it's obviously a flat or something like that, then again, that will be stipulated. So maintenance of that will more than likely be down to the landlord or the block management company. But yeah, check your tenancy agreement to see what your responsibilities are with that.
Okay, and then the last one on the list is about routers or routers, depending on which part of the country you're from. What would you say about that?
See, now when I read that, I was a little bit confused, because I've always taken mine with me. But again, I think it's probably that's something you need to check with your broadband provider as to whether, if you're moving, I mean, if you're transferring your service over, I would imagine that you would be able to take it with you. Again, if you're in a communal property, obviously you wouldn't take it, because it may be that you have communal internet. But yeah, check with your broadband provider about what your obligations are once you vacate the property.
Yeah, and I think just in addition to that, it sort of goes on from that, is always make sure the agent would read the meters when they do the checkout, but it might be useful if there's a little bit of a time period, especially in these times where agents may not necessarily be going into property straight after you've moved out, is to read meters just to make sure you've got an accurate reading for when you're ending, finishing your utility bills and whatnot. Is there anything else you want to say about trying to keep as much of your deposit as possible? Is there anything in your experience that is missed off that list that might be something tenants need to be thinking about?
Yeah, I think it's generally covered most things. I think it's very important, like we've said, just stressing having that conversation with your agent or landlord. It's really important to know what their expectations are. And again, it's just checking the documentation that you've been given, because at the end of the day, obviously that's your money. You're probably going to want it back at the end of the tenancy. It's quite often, in these circumstances in these days, it can be quite a significant amount of money, and it may obviously be helping with the property that you're moving on to. So just be open and honest with your landlord and letting agent, and it'll be good for both parties.
Yeah, and I think obviously if anybody isn't quite sure and obviously needs some advice, we're more than help here at the end of the phone, or you can drop us a message on our Facebook page. The other thing that I probably just want to touch on before we disappear off today is there was talk of the lifetime deposits in the Queen's speech. So it's looking like potentially that's going to come in. I mean, have you got any thoughts on that at the minute, Jen? Or should we leave that for another time, maybe?
Maybe we'll do that next week.
Yeah. So if anybody's interested what lifetime deposits are all about, tune in next Tuesday when we do our Tenant Tuesday tips. Again, I'd like to thank Jen today for joining us. Thanks for those pearls of wisdom. And we'll see you all soon.
Bye.